it! Get into it! Yes! We're back! As I always say, you don't have to watch these videos when they go live. You're more than welcome to watch them in your downtime, nap time, max, relax, and chillaxing time, in between time, mean time, scheme time, study time, break time, CP time. Anytime that you want to hear a highly animated voice bring you wonderful stories of magic, fantasy, science fiction, adventure, and many, many more in between. Forgive me, I'm having some lemon ginger tea, so my teeth are a bit tart, so I do apologize for that. But I did brush. It's just that the viscosity of the tea, which is one of my favorite words, it grates on your teeth. So, I mean, it's turmeric in here as well, so that also helps with your joints and whatnot. But you didn't come to hear about my ailments. You came to hear a story. And I told y'all I was going to get us caught up. So, we will be back here with Oversea and Understone on Monday. And then tomorrow is the Grim Grotto, and I still owe you all two more chapters of that. So, and then Sunday is the Hobbit, and then Friday is a special presentation for the adults only. Repeat, adults only. No kids allowed for this one on Friday. Just as a fair warning. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And no, I don't own the music that you're listening to in the background. Chapter 9. Barney, left behind, flattened his nose against the window of Jane's bedroom. He saw Simon and Jane glance up and wave, but Great Uncle Mary was marching along without looking to right or left, a tall, thin figure vanishing into the dark. Barney smiled to himself. He knew that determined stride very well. He peered after them until he could see nothing in the darkness but the lights of the village dancing in the black rippled water among the ghostly boats. From the Withers's yacht, there was no light at all. He turned away from the window, sighing a little with the frustration of being left out. To comfort himself, he took a firmer hold on the telescope case which Simon had solemnly handed over to him when they came up to say goodbye. At once, he felt better. He was a knight entrusted with a sacred mission. He had been wounded in battle, but had to guard his secret just the same. He bent each leg gently in turn and winced at the burning tightness of the skin over his knees. The enemy were all around, hunting the secret with which he held in his charge, but none of them would be able to get near. Now then, back in, come to bed, Mrs. Polk said behind him unexpectedly. Barney swung around. She was standing massive in the doorway with the light from the landing streaming round her, watching him. Barney's fingers instinctively curled tighter around the cool metal case, and he came towards her, patting softly on his bare feet. Mrs. Polk backed out onto the landing to let him through the door, and as he passed close to her, she reached out her hand curiously. "What's that you got there?" Barney jerked the case out of her reach and then quickly forced a laugh. "Oh," he said as casually as he could, "it's a telescope of the captain's I borrowed. It's jolly good. You can see all the ships coming past out in the bay. I thought I might be able to watch the others go down to the harbor with it, but it's not much good in the dark." "Ooh-ah," Mrs. Polk seemed to lose interest. "Fancy that. I've never seen the captain use any telescope. Still, there be all sorts of strange things in this house. More than I shall ever know about, I'll be bound." "Well, good night, Mrs. Polk," Barney said, making for his own room. "Good night, my dear," Mrs. Polk said. "Just give me a shout if you want anything. I reckon I'll be going to bed myself soon. My days of waiting up for fishermen are over." She disappeared downstairs, and the landing light went out. Barney switched out the lamp on the side of his bed and quietly closed the door. He felt unprotected. And rather excited still, without Great Uncle Mary in the house, he thought of pushing a chair against the door, but changed his mind when he remembered that Simon would fall over it when he came back. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to think he had been worried at being alone. He took the manuscript out to have one last look and to guess what Simon and Jane might find from the shadow of the standing stone, but he could see nothing in the rough picture of the stones and the moon. Suddenly sleepy, he slipped the roll back and turned out the light, snuggled down into the bedclothes with the case clutched to his chest and fell asleep. He knew exactly what it was that woke him. When through the confusion of half-dreams and imagined noises, he realized that he was awake. The room was quite dark. There was no sound but the constant murmur of the sea, very faint on this side of the house, but always in the air. But from the way all his senses were straining to catch something, he knew that a part which had not quite gone to sleep at all was warning him of some danger very near. He lay very still, but he could hear nothing. Then there was a faint creak behind him from the direction of the door. Barney felt his heart begin to thump a little faster. He was used to hearing noises at night. Their flat in London was part of a very old house, which creaked and muttered all the time at night as if the walls and floors were breathing. Although he had never been awake here long enough to find out, he guessed that the gray house probably did the same, but this noise somehow was not as friendly as those. Barney did what he did at home whenever he woke up and heard a noise that sounded more like a burglar than an ordinary creak of the floor. He made the small, grumbling, yawning whimper that people give sometimes in their sleep and turned over in bed as if he were settling himself down without waking up. As he turned, he half opened his eye for a quick look around the room. At home, when he did this, there was never anything to see at all, and he fell asleep again, feeling rather foolish. But this time it was different. By a faint line of light, he could see that the door was standing open, and near it, the glow of a small torch was moving across the room. The light of the torch stopped quite still as he moved. Barney snuggled into his new position, lay still, and breathed deeply for several minutes with his eyes closed. Gradually, he heard the small noises begin again. He lay listening, more perplexed than frightened now. Who was it? What were they doing? It can't be someone who wants to knock me on the head, he said to himself, or they'd have knocked me on the head before this. They don't want to wake me up, and they don't want to make a noise. They're looking for something. He groped under the bedclothes, careful not to show any movement or make a noise. The telescope case was still there, and he kept tight hold of it. Then he heard another noise. The person moving noiselessly about in his room in the dark sniffed very slightly. The noise was almost imperceptible, but Barney recognized it as the he had heard before. He grinned to himself in relief, feeling his muscles relax. Very slowly, he edged his hand out from under the bedclothes towards the bedside table and switched on the light. Mrs. Polk jumped, dropped her torch with a clatter, and clapped her hand to her heart. For some seconds, Barney was completely puzzled by the sudden light flooding the room, but he blinked his eyes clear in time to see disappointment and surprise on her face. Quickly, she pulled herself together and gave him a broad, reassuring smile. There now, I think I hadn't waked you up. What a pity. I'm so sorry, my dear. Did I frighten you? Barney said bluntly, What are you doing, Mrs. Polk? Came up to see if you was all right and sleeping properly, and I thought while I was up here I'd pick up your dirty cup to wash up with the rest of the things downstairs. Had your Horlocks up here, remember? Bless the boy, she added fondly. He's half asleep still. Barney stared at her. He did feel sleepy, but not too sleepy to remember Jane coming into his room when he had first gone up to bed and saying, Mrs. Polk said, would I come up pick up your cup if you'd finish, or do you want any more? Jane took my cup. Mrs. Polk looked vaguely around the room and gazed wide-eyed at his empty bedside table. So she did, then. It quite slipped my mind. What a silly old thing I be. Well, I'll leave ye to go back to sleep. My love, I'm so sorry to have waked ye. She bustled with almost comical speed out of the room. Barney had almost fallen asleep again when he heard low voices outside the door, and Simon came in. He shot up in bed. What happened? Did you find anything? Where did you go? Nothing happened much, Simon said wearily. He pulled off his windbreaker and sweater and dropped them on the floor. We found where we've got to go next, where the next clue leads. It's those rocks at the end of Kamar Head right over the sea. Did you go and look? Excuse me? Is there anything there? No, we didn't. Simon was abrupt, trying not to remember the nastiness of the moments when he and Jane had been alone in the dark. Why not? The enemy were up there, that's why. All around us in the dark, and one of them was this man who chased me that day with the boy. Only Jane says it was the vicar. I don't know, it's all awfully complicated. Anyway, we ran away and nobody followed us. Funny, they all seemed scared of Gummery. Who were they? Don't know. Simon yawned hugely. Look, I'm going down to have some cocoa. We can talk in the morning. Barney lay down sighing. All right. Oh, he jerked up again. Wait a minute. Shut the door. Simon looked at him curiously and pushed the door shut. What is it? You mustn't say anything in front of Mrs. Polk. Not a word. Tell Jane. We shouldn't. She wouldn't understand anyway. Oh, Barney said importantly. That's what you think. I woke up just now. She was snooping around the room in the dark with a torch. Good job I had the map all safe. She's after it. I bet you she's after it. I think she's bad. Simon said skeptically, looking at him. Barney's hair was ruffled and his eyes shadowed with sleep. It was very easy to believe that what he was describing had been no more than a dream. When they were downstairs in the morning, Mrs. Polk was bustling energetically about the kitchen, beating eggs with her elbow, flicking up and down like a machine. Breakfast, she said brightly. Barney watched her closely, but he could see nothing but good humor and beaming honesty. And yet he said incessantly to himself, she looked so guilty when I turned on the light. It's a wonderful day today, Jane said happily as they sat down. The wind's still quite strong, but there isn't a cloud anywhere. Must have blown them all away. Ah, well, let's hope it doesn't blow the marquee away as well, Mrs. Polk said, putting an enormous jug of creamy yellow milk on the table. What marquee? What? Mrs. Polk opened her eyes. Haven't you seen the posters? Why, it's Carnival Day today. People come in from all round, even from St. Austell. All sorts of things go on. There's a swimming gala in the harbour, then the band come out, and there's dancing all up the street from the sea. They played the floral dance. You know the tune, surely? She began to sing lustily. I know it, Simon said, but I thought they only danced it somewhere else. Helston, said Jane, the Helston furry dance. Yes, so they do, Mrs. Polk said. I reckon they copied it from us myself. Everyone knows the Essex floral dance. It was danced in my grandmother's time. Everyone dressed up gay and fancy in costume, and there's a great crowd in the street all a-dancing and laughing. No one goes out fishing today. There's a great marquee in the field beyond the village, and all kinds of stalls and games and wrestling. Then when the sun begins to go down, they crown the carnival queen, and they stand round the arbour long after it's dark and dance in the moonlight. 'Tis a long time before anyone wants to go to sleeping through Issac. Carnival Day. What fun, Jane said. Said Simon. Oh, you mustn't miss it, Mrs. Polk said earnestly. I shall be there every minute. 'Tis like the old days all over again. But now here I stand talking and your scrambled eggs would be getting hard on the stove. She turned and sailed out of the room. It does sound fun, Jane said reproachfully to Simon. I dare say we've got other things to do. Of course, if you'd rather go to the carnival than find the Grail. Shh! Barney looked nervously at the door. Oh, don't worry about her. She's all right. Great Uncle Mary's a long time coming down, isn't he? Didn't mean it, Jane said meekly. Actually, what I want to do more than anything is get back up on the headland so we can go and find that rock. We can't go without Gummery. I wonder if he's awake. I'll go and see. Barney slipped from his chair. Hey, where be off to? Mrs. Polk nearly collided with him, carrying her tray through the door. Sit down and eat this now while 'tis hot. I was going to call Great Uncle Mary. Now you leave him be, poor old gentleman, Mrs. Polk said firmly, gadding about in the middle of the night, time natural at his age. No wonder he's having a good long sleep. Night fishing indeed, and not a fish to show for it after all that traipsing about. You're proper wearied him last night, I reckon. You remember we aren't all as young as you three. She wagged a finger at them. Now you get along into the sun after your breakfast and let Mavis sleep out. She departed again, shutting the door behind her. Oh dear, Jane said, abashed. She's right, you know. Great Uncle Mary is quite old, really. Well, he's not doddering, Simon said defensively. He doesn't seem old at all sometimes. He went like a rocket last night and carrying you. It was all I could do to keep up with him. Well, perhaps this is the after effect. Jane's conscience was beginning to nag. Last night must have been an awful strain on him, what with one thing and another. I don't think we should wake him up. It's only 9 o'clock after all. But we haven't made any plans up yet. Perhaps we just ought to wait here till he does wake up, Simon said despondently. Oh no, why should we? He wouldn't mind if we went on to the headland. He can follow us when he's had his sleep. Didn't you say we shouldn't go anywhere without him from now on? Barney said doubtfully. Or anyway, not without telling him? Well, we can leave a message for him with Mrs. Polk. No, we can't. Barney thinks Mrs. Polk is one of the enemies, said Simon skeptically. Oh, surely not, Jane said vaguely. Well, anyway, we don't really have to leave a message. He's bound to guess where we've gone. There's only one place any of us would want to go, and that's the rocks on Kimar Head. We can say to Mrs. Polk that he'll know where we've gone, just like that, and then she'll tell him and that he'll understand. And say we've taken Rufus for a walk, said Barney hopefully. That's not a bad idea. Where is he? In the kitchen. I'll go and get him. Tell Mrs. Polk while you're there and tell her we'll see her at our beloved carnival. We'll probably will anyway. Barney bolted the last of his scrambled egg and went out to the kitchen, munching a piece of toast. Simon suddenly had an idea. He got up and crossed to the window and peered down onto the hill. He turned back quickly to Jane. We might have known. They're watching us already. That boy's at the bottom of the road, sitting on the wall, not doing anything, just sitting there looking up. They must be waiting for us to come out. Because they don't know where we found a clue last night that will lead us somewhere. Oh gosh, Jane bit her lip. Their night on the headland had left her more deeply nervous than ever before, as if they were fighting not people but a dark force that used people as its tools and could do what it liked with them. Isn't there a back way out of the house up to the headland? I don't know. How funny. We've never looked. Well, we've been doing other things. I suppose even if there was one, they'd be watching it. Well, the only person we'd be likely to know about a back way is that Bill, and he's at the front. There's no harm in looking. Barney had come back with Rufus lolloping joyfully at his side. There is a way, he said. You can get through the hedge at the top of the back garden. I found him one morning before you were up. Rufus showed me, actually. He was dashing about and suddenly he disappeared. Then I heard him barking miles away outside, halfway up the headland. You come out into a lane, and then you're out on Kamar Head before you know it. It's a good way out because they wouldn't expect us to go through. There's no gate or anything. Gubbery won't know about that way, Jane said suddenly. He'll come out the front way and they'll follow him, and it'll be just as bad as if they'd follow us in the first place. No fear, Barney said confidently. He'll shake them off somehow. I bet you this one time they won't have the slightest idea where we are. When the children were gone and the house lay silent, Mrs. Polk spent 2 brisk hours working downstairs. She took care not to make a noise, and she sat down in the kitchen to drink a leisurely cup of tea. She made the tea very strong, using one of the captain's best cups, very large and made of thin, almost translucent white china. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping from it, a look of great secret satisfaction on her face. After a while, she went to a cupboard behind the sink, pulled out her big shopping bag, and took from it a brilliant jumble of colored ribbons with an elaborate feathery structure not unlike a red Indian headdress. She set this on her head, looked at herself in the mirror, and chuckled. Then she carefully put it aside and poured out some more tea in a fresh cup. She put this on a tray and sailed it out into the hall and up the stairs in a great, smiling, mysterious gallon of a woman. Without knocking, she opened the door of Great Uncle Mary's room, went in, set down the tray by the bed. Great Uncle Mary was buried in the bedclothes, breathing heavily. Mrs. Polk pulled back the curtains to let the light pour into the dim room, bent down and shook him roughly by the shoulder. As he stirred, she drew back quickly and stood waiting, beaming down at him with her usual doting motherly smile. He yawned, groaned, and clutched his head sleepily, running his fingers back through the untidy white hair. Time to get up, Professor, said Mrs. Polk brightly. Nice long rest I'll let ye have, after all that getting about last night. Done ye good, I'll be bound. Not all as young as we used to be, are we now? Great Uncle Mary looked at her and grunted, blinking himself awake. Drink his tea now, and I'll go and get his breakfast. Mrs. Polk's rich voice flowed on as she turned to twitch the curtains away. Can't have in peace and blessed quiet for once. They children have been out for hours. Suddenly, Great Uncle Mary was very wide awake. He sat up straight back, a startling sight in his bright red pajama jacket. What time is it? Why, 'tis gone 11, Mrs. Polk beamed at him. Where have the children gone? Now, don't you worry about them. They look after themselves well enough for one day. Little idiots. Where are they? His forehead creased. Now, Professor, Mrs. Polk said chidingly. Gone off to save a journey they have, as a matter of fact. Thoughtful, well-brought-up little things they are, for all their mothers a bit higgledy-piggledy. Begging your pardon. Gone off to Truro for ye. Truro? Mrs. Polk smiled innocently. Yes, that's right. Young Simon answered the telephone this morning. Nasty little machine, she added confidently, shuddering slightly. He scared me out of my life, screeching away. Talked to the man on the other end for a long time, he did. After he came to me and said, all serious, bless his heart, Mrs. Polk, he says, there was a friend of Great Uncle Mary's on the telephone from the museum at Truro, saying he's got to see us all very urgently about something. Who was it? Wait a minute now, Professor, I'm not finished. I reckon we ought to go off at once if Great Uncle's still asleep, young Simon says to me, and catch the bus. Then can come on after us when he wakes up. Who was it? Great Uncle Mary insisted. Simon didn't give me no name. Very important he made it sound. So off they all went, 3 of them, and got the bus into St. Austell. Don't you worry, Mrs. Polk, they said. Just tell our granduncle for us. You should never let them go alone, Great Uncle Mary said curtly. If you'll excuse me, Mrs. Polk, I should like to get up. Of course, said Mrs. Polk indulgently, still smiling and unruffled. She sailed out of the room. Within minutes, Great Uncle Mary was downstairs, fully dressed, frowning to himself and occasionally muttering anxiously. He waved away his breakfast and went striding out of the grey house. Mrs. Polk, watching from the doorstep, saw his big battered car appear on the road and roar off, leaving a great black smear of smoke hanging in the air as it disappeared out of the village. She smiled to herself and went back into the grey house. A few moments later, she came out again, the small secret smile still hovering round her mouth, locked the door behind her, and went off with her shopping bag down the hill to the harbor, a few bright red and blue feathers nodding over the top of the bag as it swung at her side. So she lied to him. She's working about the enemy. Oh, okay, I skipped it. Okay. Chapter 10. This isn't nearly as simple as I thought it would be, Simon said, frowning. He looked about him at the jagged gray rocks. From the standing stones last night, it looked as if there was just one lump of rock here, sticking out on its own. But there's so many of them, and they're all so big. The wind blowing in from the open sea tossed Jane's ponytail and to and fro on the back of her neck. She looked back inland. It's just like being out at sea, as if we were cut off, and looking at the land from the outside. The end of Kamar Head was a more desolate place than any they had yet seen, even with the sunlight glittering in the water far below. And the smell of the sea and the wind, they stood in the midst of a bleak patch of rocks rising bare out of the grass, almost at the headland's tip. The ground fell away before them in a steep grassy slope, and from there the sheer edge of the cliff dropped to meet the other rocks, 200 feet below, where the white waves endlessly grunted and sighed. They could see no sign of life or movement anywhere around. It's lonely, Barney said. It feels lonely itself. I mean, somehow, different from us feeling lonely. I wonder what the next clue is, if there is one. I don't think there is, Jane said slowly. This is as so much an end of a place. It doesn't lead anywhere. Everything leads towards it. Funny how we didn't see anybody at all on the way up. There are usually one or two people wandering about, even on the headlands. There certainly were last night, Simon said. Oh, don't. I keep trying not to remember, but there just isn't a living thing up anywhere near here. I think it's odd. Gotta drink your tea. Mr. Penhallow says the locals keep away from the end of the headland, Barney said, clambering to perch above their heads on one of the rocks. Rufus tried to climb up beside him, slithered back again and licked his ankle, whining. They don't like the standing rocks much either, but they've never come up here at all. He wouldn't talk about it much. He said people thought the rocks were haunted and unlucky, and he sounded as if he believed it himself. He said they called them the gravestones. They call the standing stones that? No, these rocks here. Funny. I should have thought it would be the other way around. The rocks do look rather like gravestones in a kind of way, but these are rocks like any other rocks. Well, that's what he said. Barney shrugged his shoulders and nearly overbalanced. Just that people didn't like them. I wonder why. Jane gazed up at the nearest crag of rock rising just above her head. Simon next to her taped idly at its surface with the old brass telescope case. The manuscript safely rolled up inside. Barney had ceremonially handed it back that morning, then suddenly he stopped tapping and stood stock still. Whatever's the matter? Have you found something? Jane peered at the rock. No? Yes. Oh, it's all right. I'm not looking at anything. Don't you remember in the manuscript? I can hear Great Uncle Mary saying it now, where the Cornishman said he hid the Grail. Over sea and under stone. That's right, and the same when they buried the strange knight. What was his name? Bedwin. Barney said, Golly, I see what you mean. Over sea and under stone. Here! But, Jane said, it must be. Simon hopped distractedly on one foot. Over sea. Well, we could be anywhere that was much more obviously over the sea, could we? And under stone. Well, here are the stones. And this must be where they buried Bedwin as well. Barney hastily slithered down from the rock. That's why they call it the gravestones. They think it's haunted. They've forgotten all the real story, because it's hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But they remembered that bit, or at least they remember people being frightened to come here, and so they don't come at all. Perhaps they're right, Jane said nervously. Oh, come off it. Well, anyway, even if Bedwin's ghost was floating about somewhere, we wouldn't want to scare us because we're on the same side as he was. Great Uncle Mary said something like that last night. Jane screwed up her forehead to remember. She's thinking. Screwing up your forehead is like, I'm thinking. Oh, never mind. Don't you realize what this means? We're there! We found it! Barney spluttered with delight. Rufus, catching his mood, pranced joyfully around them, barking into the wind. Simon looked at him. All right, then. Where is it? Well, Barney said, pausing a little. Here, under one of the rocks. Yes, well, just stop rushing about like a madman and think for a minute. What do we have to do to dig them all up? They're part of the headland. It's all rock. Look! Simon took out his penknife, a hefty steel weapon with 2 big blades and a marsless spike, and went down on his knees to dig away the earth at the foot of one of the crags. He tore away tufts of grass, dug a hole, and 3 inches from the surface came to solid rock. There, you see? He scraped at the rock with his knife blade, making a depressing grating sound. How could there be anything buried there? It doesn't all have to be like that, Barney said rebelliously. Perhaps there's a different bit somewhere, Jane said hopefully. If we all 3 divide up and search every inch, we're bound to find something. We ought to have brought spades with us, really. Come on. So Barney went on to one end of the rocks and Jane 20 yards away to the other. Simon, glancing nervously down at the steep edge of the headland, went round to the seaward side and began working his way up from there. They clambered up and down over the sharp-edged granite, searching the patches of wiry grass between the rocks, tugging at the boulders to see if they would move and show a place where something could be buried underneath. But no stone ever shifted an inch, and they found nothing but granite and grass with no hint of a hiding place. Jane was holding something carefully in her hand as they came together again. Look, she said, holding it out. Don't you think it's peculiar finding a seashell up here? I mean, how on earth could it have got up from the beach, especially if no one else comes up here? It's more like a stone than a shell, Simon said curiously, taking it from her hand. It was a cockle shell, but its hollow was solid and hard, filled with what looked like rock, and the surface of the shell was not white and roughened like those they found on the beach, but smooth and dark gray. A visitor must have dropped it, Barney said easily. Visitors wouldn't be fond of coming up here. They wouldn't know anything about what the Thuisic people would say. I suppose so. They all thought of visitors scornfully. Oh, well, Jane put the shell in her pocket and looked around helplessly. This is awful. We're stuck. What can we do now? There must be something up here. There must. We don't really know. Perhaps it's just another step on the ladder after all. But there's nothing else marked to follow. Let's have a look at the map again. Simon squatted down on the grass and unscrewed the telescope case, and they peered at the manuscript, its words and lines faint brown in the sun. I'm certain he meant this to be the end of the quest, Barney said obstinately. Look at the way the end of the headland stands all on its own. There's nothing to lead anywhere else. Simon stared pensively at the map. Perhaps it just leads back where we started from. He might have been pulling our legs all the while. Sort of insurance policy to make it difficult for anyone to find the Grail. Perhaps he hid it somewhere we shall never find. Perhaps he took it with him after all. Perhaps it doesn't exist. They sat around in a gloomy group, ignoring the sunshine and the magnificent sweep of coast and sea. There was a long, despondent silence. Barney glanced up idly. Where's Rufus got to? Don't know, Simon said morosely. Fallen over the cliff, I expect. Sort of stupid thing that animal would do. Oh no! Barney scrambled to his feet in concern. I hope he's all right. Rufus! Rufus! He put his 2 fingers in his mouth and let out an ear-splitting whistle. I can't do it. My dad can do it. I've done it at least once or twice in life, but it's like... I can do that, but I can't do the high-pitched, long-range whistle. My dad could do it, and that was the way my dad would call me and my siblings home during the summertime when I would go visit with him in Cleveland. He would either go, "Eh," or he would go, and I'm like, oh, that's my dad. I gotta go. They saw nothing and heard nothing but the wind, and then they became aware of a curious noise just above their heads, a kind of snuffling, scrambling whine. He's up there! Barney clambered around the side of the rocks, and they saw the top of his fair head appear behind a jutting gray hump as he stood up. Then he suddenly vanished. His voice came over the rocks to them on the wind, muffled but tense with excitement. Hey, come over here, quick! The rocks made a kind of fortress, rising one after the other like rows of battlements. They found him in the middle, crouching beside one of the peaks, watching Rufus. The dog stood quivering and intent, his nose close against the rock, one paw scraping feebly as he whined and sniffed. Quick, Barney said without turning around. I don't know what he's trying to do, but I think he's found something. I've never seen him like this before. If it's rats or rabbits, he just goes mad and barks and rushes about. But this is different. Look at him. Rufus seemed to be standing in a trance, unable to tear himself away from the rock face. Let me look, Simon said. He stepped carefully past Barney and put one arm around Rufus's neck, fondling him under the chin as he drew him away from the rock. There's a tiny gap there. His voice came back to him. I could get my fingers inside. Ow! I say, this top rock moves. I felt it shift. I'm sure I did. Nearly caught my hand. It's terrifically big. But I think... Jane, can you get round on my other side? Jane squeezed herself between the rocks next to him. Now get hold there, Simon directed her. That jutting out bit when I tell you. Push as hard as you can away from you towards the sea. Wait a minute. I've got to get a grip on my side. I don't know if this'll work. Now heave! 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 Obediently, but without an idea of what she was supposed to be doing, Jane pushed with all her might at the rock face, with Simon panting and heaving beside her. For a long, strained moment, nothing happened. Then, just as their lungs seemed about to burst, they felt the rock move beneath their hands. It gave a very slight tremor, and then a grinding, grating lurch. They staggered back, and the great, rough, round rock rolled away from his hands and down into the nearest hollow. They could feel the churning thud of its fall shake the rock where they stood. Where the boulder had been, there was a dark, shapeless hole about 2 feet across. They stood still, gaping. Rufus pattered forward across the rocks, bent his head to sniff delicately at it, and then turned back, his tail waving and his tongue hanging out over his teeth, as if he were grinning. Simon moved forward at last and pulled away a couple of smaller rocks from the edge of the hole. He knelt down by it and peered inside, then put his arm in to see how deep it was. His arm disappeared up to his shoulder, until he was lying flat and could feel nothing but rough rocks at the sides. He blinked up at Barney and Jane. I can't feel any bottom to it, he said, hushed. His voice brought back their own, and they found they had been holding their breaths. Get up, let's have a look. This mustn't be it, mustn't it? It must be where he hid the grail. How deep do you think it was? Gosh, this is terrific. Clever old Rufus. Rufus waved his tail faster. That chunk of rock, Jane said, looking at it reverently where it lay tumbled on its side. It must have been there for 900 years. Imagine. 900 years. Well, it wasn't exactly loose, was it? Simon flexed his strained arm muscles tenderly, though it must have been fairly delicately balanced, or we wouldn't have been able to shift it at all. Anyway, we've got to find how deep this goes before we know if there's anything there. He looked thoughtfully at the gaping dark mouth in the rock. Jane sighed to herself and stopped, thinking about the centuries. Drop a stone down, then you can hear how deep it is. Like thunderstorms. You know, counting the seconds between the lightning and the thunder to see how far away the storm is. Simon picked up a loose chunk of rock from the edge of the hole and poised it over the blackness. He let go and it dropped out of sight. They listened. Excuse me. After a long time, Jane sat back on her heels. I couldn't hear anything. Nor could I. Try again. Simon dropped another stone into the hole, and again they strained their ears to hear it strike the bottom. Nothing happened. There wasn't anything there then, either. No. It must be bottomless. Don't be an idiot. It can't be. Perhaps it comes out in Australia, Barney said. He looked nervously at the hole. It just means the noise was too far away for us to hear, Simon said, but it must be tremendously deep. I wish we'd have brought a rope. Look in your pockets, Jane said. There's always full of junk. So are Barney's. At least Mother's always saying so when she has to empty them. You might have some string or something. Junk yourself, Simon said indignantly, but he turned out his pockets to the rock. The results, though interesting, were not very much help. Simon laid out an array of belongings, including his knife, a very dirty handkerchief, a little scratched glass-covered compass, 2 and 7pence, and a halfpenny, a stump of candle, 2 screwed-up bus tickets, 4 toffees in battered cellophane wrappers, and a fountain pen. Well, he said, we could have a toffee each anyway. He handed them around solemnly. The toffees were slightly furry and at the edges where the cellophane had come loose, but tasted none of the worse for that. Simon gave the 4 to Rufus, who made a few grimacing attempts to chew it and then swallow it whole. What a waste, Barney said. He emptied his own pockets in a shower of sand, a green glass marble with an orange pip in the middle, a small white pebble, a 6pence and 4 farthings, a headless lead sailor, a handkerchief miraculously much cleaner than Simon's, and a thick piece of wire curved round at both ends. Whatever do you carry that for? Demanded Jane. Well, you never know, Barney said vaguely. It might come in useful. Come on, let's have a look at yours. Nothing in them, Jane said, a trifle smugly. She pulled both pockets out of her jeans inside out. "Well, you brought your own duffel coat," said Simon. He crossed the rocks, climbing down to the grass of the headland where they had been standing, and brought the jacket back. "Here we are. 1 handkerchief, 2 hair clips, just like a girl, 2 pencils, a box of matches. Whatever do you want those for?" "Like Barney, it might come in useful." "A lot more useful than that old bit of wire, anyway." Simon felt in the other pocket. Money, a button. "What's this?" He brought out a spool of cotton. "Now that's an idea. Pretty daft thing to carry about, but it might help us find how deep the hole is." "I'd forgotten I had that," Jane said. "All right, you win. I carry junk around too. But you must admit it's sensible junk." She took the cotton reel from him. "It says there's 100 yards of cotton on this. Well, no hole could be that deep, surely." "I wouldn't be surprised with this one," Simon said. "Tie something to the cotton and lower it down." "Have to be something pretty light," Barney said, "or it'll break." Jane unwound a length of cotton and pulled on it. "Oh, I don't know. It's pretty strong. Here, I know. Give me that bit of wire." Simon looked at her doubtfully, but handed it over. Jane tied one end of the cotton to its curved end. "There. Now we could just lower it and wait till it hits bottom." "I know a better way." Simon took the reel back and put one of Jane's pencils through the hole in the middle. It was just long enough to protrude at each side. "Well, you hold on to both ends of the pencil, and the reel unwinds of its own accord because of the weight. Like playing a fish." "Let me do it." Jane knelt down beside the hole and dropped the wire into its dark mouth. The cotton reel spun round as the thread disappeared, and they held their breaths. Then suddenly the reel slowed, turned wearily, and came to a halt. Just as they were thinking that the wire had reached firm ground, they saw at the end of the cotton blowing loose. "Bother," Jane said in disappointment. "It's broken." She looked down to the blackness in a vain attempt to see where the cotton had gone. Simon took the reel from her and examined it. Half the cotton's gone anyway, and still hadn't hit anything. That means the hole must be at least 50 yards deep. There's 150 feet. Good grief! He tapped Jane on the shoulder. "Come on, dopey. You won't see anything down there." Jane flapped her hand at him, still bending over the hole. "Shut up!" They waited patiently until she straightened herself, red in the face. "I can hear the sea," she said, blinking in the sunlight. "Of course you can hear the sea. So can I. It's just over the edge of the headland." No. I mean, I can hear it down there." Simon looked at her and tapped his head inside, but Barney lay down close to the hole and put his head inside. "She's right. She's right, you know," he said, eagerly looking up. "Come and put your ear down here." Said Simon skeptically and lay down beside him. Then he heard very faintly, coming up from the depths of the hole, a hollow booming sound. It faded and then rose again, slow and regular. "Is that the sea?" "Of course it is," Jane said. "That deep gonging sort of noise. Don't you recognize it? The sort of noise waves make when they wash into a cave. And think what it means. The hole must go all the way down through the cliff to the sea, and there must be an entrance down there. That's where the Cornishman hid the Grail." "But it can't go all that way," Simon said, slowly rubbing his ear. "Could this be vibration or something coming to the edge of the rocks down below?" "Well, I ask you, does it sound like it?" "No," Simon admitted, "it doesn't. Only, how could anyone have made such a narrow little hole so deep?" "Goodness knows, but he did, didn't he? Perhaps that little shell I found was thrown through it somehow." "Then if the Grail is down there, we have to get at it from the entrance from when the sea comes. There must be a cave. I wonder if we can climb round from the harbor." "Listen!" Barney suddenly scrambled to his feet and stood upright, his head cocked. "I heard something, like an engine." Simon and Jane stood up and listened to the distant waves and the gustling wind. They could hear seagulls crying, the plaintive yelping calls blown towards them from below, and then the noise Barney had heard, the low thrumming of an engine from the direction of the harbor. It was Simon who caught sight of the long white bow of the yacht moving around the curve of Kamar Head. He crouched low. "Get down, quick!" he said hoarsely. "It's them! It's the Lady Mary!" Barney and Jane dropped to the ground beside him. "They can't see us if we keep behind the rocks," Simon said quietly. "Don't move anyone until they've gone out of sight." "I've got a gap here," Barney whispered. "I can see them through the rock. Mr. Withers is on the deck, and his sister with him. Their skipper's not there. He must be in the cockpit. They're looking this way, not up here. They seem to be looking at the cliffs. Mr. Withers has got binoculars. Now he's put them down, and he's turned to his sister to say something. I can't see the expression on his face. They aren't near enough. I wish they'd come closer in. Oh, Jane swallowed, husky with agitation. Suppose there is a cave down there where the Grail is, and they see it. The idea was paralyzing, and they lay rigid, 3 minds wishing the boat away. The noise of the Lady Mary's engine grew louder, passing the end of the headland close below them. Where are they going? What are they doing? Simon hissed urgently. I can't see. There's a rock in the way now. Barney wriggled with frustration. The noise of the engine filled the air, but it did not stop. As they listened breathless, it grew gradually less, moving away across the sea. I can see them again now. There's another gap. He's still looking at the coast through the binoculars. I don't think he's seen anything. It's as if he's still hunting. Now they've gone around the corner. Barney rolled over and sat up. If they're looking for a cave, how did they know? They can't know. They haven't seen the map, Jane said in anguish. They couldn't possibly. I mean, even if the vicar is in league with them, and they know about the outline I drew in the guidebook, it hasn't got any sort of clue. I don't put any of the evidence. I didn't put any of the clue marks in. But if they don't know where to look, why are they looking in the right place? I think, Simon said reassuringly, it's just part of their routine. I mean, they don't know where to look, so they look everywhere. Great Uncle Mary said something like that the very first day we talked. It's like the way they searched the house, all at random, without any sort of plan. Perhaps they thought of the idea of a cave vaguely, and they're scouring the whole coast in case they find one. Now, just this part, but all the way up and down, they don't know there is one. Well, we do, if it's there. Why didn't they see it? Perhaps they did, Barney said gloomily. Oh, no, they can't have done. They'd have stopped. At any rate, they wouldn't have gone on looking like you said they would. But you did say that, didn't you? Jay looked at him nervously. Oh, yes, old Withers is still squinting hard through his binoculars when they went out of sight. Well, then? We heard the sea, so the mouth of the cave might be covered. It might be underwater. That could be why they didn't see it. There are lots of underwater caves in Cornwall. I remember reading about them somewhere. It might have been like that when our Cornishmen hid the Grail, but perhaps the land sunk a bit in 900 years. Well, that's good, Barney said. They'd never be able to find it then. Simon looked at him and raised his eyebrows. Nor should we. Barney stared. Oh, surely we could. You can dive pretty well. We wouldn't have a chance. I can dive, but I'm not a fish. I suppose the whole thing would be full of water, Jane said slowly, and the Grail will be under the sea and all eaten away like wrecks of ships. Covered in barnacles. Ugh, said Simon. It can't be, it mustn't be. He said over the sea, and it must be over the sea. We shall have to find out. Great Uncle Mary will know. They stared at one another in consternation. Gummery, I've forgotten all about him. Where is he? We've been up here for ages. He must have woken up hours ago. Barney, what exactly did you ask Miss Polk to tell him? I said, would she say we'd gone for a walk with Rufus? He know where. She looked at me with a bit funny, but she said she'd given him the message. I tried to make it sound like a game, said Barney, very serious. I do hope nothing's happened to him, Jane said anxiously. Don't worry, I suspect he's still snoring, Simon said. He looked at his watch. It's 11:30. Let's go down quickly before the yacht comes back. We might not be so lucky next time. If they come back under sail, we shouldn't hear them. I wonder why they didn't last time. There's more than enough wind. He frowned. Oh, never mind, Barney said. Let's go and find Gummery. Round the back again. That boy might still be watching the front. No, we shall have to go the front way. Gummery might be coming up. I've got a feeling we haven't much time left. We shall have to risk getting caught. Come on. And that is where we will end for today. We only have 3 chapters left, y'all, and then we're on to book 2, which is one of my favorites. Probably the top favorite out of all of these. Okay, hold on. Dang, okay. So, The Dark is Rising is the second book. I know this. The series is called The Dark is Rising Sequence, but one of the books in that has the title The Dark is Rising. So, without further ado, I love you. Have a great day on my favorite day of the week, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye, y'all. Have a great day.